Islam. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to our conversation with Canadian physician and author Dr. Gabor Maté. His 4 books include Scattered, How Attention Deficit Disorder Originates and What You Can Do About It, and Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. Talk about how the drugs, Gabor Maté, affect the development of the brain when kids are saturated with these drugs to sit still in school so that they're not fidgeting at their desk. They can't focus on reading or on the teacher, or they're just plain old disruptive. What happens? Well,
there's a number of issues here. How the stimulant drugs work is that in ADD, there's an essential brain chemical which is necessary for incentive and motivation that seems to be lacking. That's called dopamine. And dopamine is simply an essential life chemical. Without it, there's no life. Mice in a laboratory who have no dopamine will starve themselves to death because they have no incentive to eat. Even though they're hungry and even though their life is in danger, they will not eat because there's no motivation or incentive. So partly, one way to look at ADD is a massive problem of motivation because the dopamine is lacking in the brain. Now, the stimulant medications elevate dopamine levels, and these kids are now more motivated. They can focus and pay attention. However, the assumption underneath giving these kids medications is that what we're dealing with here is a genetic disorder, and the only way to deal with it is pharmacologically. And if you actually look at how the dopamine levels in the brain develop, if you look at infant monkeys and you measure their dopamine levels and they're normal when they're with their mothers, and when you separate them from mothers, the dopamine levels go down within 2 or 3 days. So in other words, what we're doing is we're correcting a massive social problem that has to do with disconnection in a society and the loss of nurturing, non-stress parenting, and we're replacing that chemically. Now, the stimulant drugs do seem to work, and a lot of kids are helped by it. The problem is not so much whether they should be used or not. The problem is that 80% of the time, a kid is prescribed a medication, that's all that happens. Nobody talks to the family about the family environment. The school makes no attempt to change the school environment. Nobody connects with these kids emotionally. In other words, it's seen as simply as a medical or behavior problem, but not as a problem of development.
Gabor Maté, you talk about acting out. What does acting out mean?
Well, it's a great question. You see, when we hear the phrase acting out, we usually mean that a kid is behaving badly, that a child is being obstreperous, oppositional, violent, bullying, rude. That's because we don't know how to speak English anymore. The phrase acting out means you portray in behavior that which you haven't got the words to say in language. In a game of charades, you have to act out because you're not allowed to speak. If you landed in a country where nobody spoke your language and you were hungry, you'd have to literally demonstrate your hunger through behavior, pointing to your mouth or to your empty belly, because you don't have the words. My point is that, yes, a lot of children are acting out, but it's not bad behavior. It's a representation of emotional losses and emotional lacks in their lives. And whether it's, again, bullying or a whole set of other behaviors, what we're dealing with here is childhood stunted emotional development, in some cases, stunted brain development. And rather than trying to control these behaviors through punishments or even just exclusively through medications, we need to help these kids develop.
We're talking to Dr. Gabor Maté, #1 Canadian bestseller. His book, Scattered, about ADD. Well, let me just ask you about that title, Scattered, why you chose it.
I didn't. The Canadian title was Scattered Minds. And you look at the origins and healing of attention deficit disorder. Now, the American publisher, in its wisdom, decided that the American public couldn't handle the word mind. So they published it as Scattered, only to have the same publisher publish another book on ADD called Scattered Minds 8 years later, just to make things confusing for the public. But it's the subtitle that interests me. My original subtitle was A New Look at the Origins and Healing. In other words, what I'm saying is we have to just look at it, really look at what this is all about. It's not about disease, it's about childhood development. The American title became How ADD Originates and What You Can Do About It. The typical American do-it-yourself self-helpism, you know, rather than actually taking a pause to look. We right away want to jump. It's sort of American foreign policy, you know. Rather than looking at anything, we're just going to jump in there and do what we want to do.
You mentioned you suffered from ADD, attention deficit disorder, yourself, and were drugged for it. Explain your own story.
Well, I was in my early 50s, and I was working in palliative care at the time. I was coordinator of a palliative care unit at a large Canadian hospital. And the social worker in the unit, who'd just been diagnosed as an adult, told me about her story.
Just been diagnosed as an addict?
An adult.
An adult?
Yeah, this social worker was diagnosed at age 38.
Oh, as an adult.
No, as an adult.
ADD.
And as a physician, I was like most physicians who know nothing about ADD. Most physicians really don't know about the condition. But when she told me her story, I realized that was me. And subsequently, I was diagnosed.
And what was that story? What did you realize was you?
Oh, poor impulse control a lot of my life, impulsive behaviors, disorganization, a tendency to tune out a lot, be absent-minded, physical restlessness. I mean, I was, you know, I had trouble sitting still. All the traits, you know, that I saw in the literature on ADD, I recognized in myself, which is kind of an epiphany in a sense, because you get to understand, at least you get a sense of why you're behaving the way you're behaving. What never made sense to me right from the beginning, though, is the idea of ADD as a genetic disease. And not even after a couple of my kids were diagnosed with it, I still didn't buy the idea that it's genetic, because it isn't. Again, it has to do with, in my case, very stressed circumstances as an infant, which I talked about on a previous program. In the case of my children, it's because their father was a workaholic doctor who wasn't emotionally available to them. And under those circumstances, children are stressed. I mean, children are stressed when their brains are developing. One way to deal with the stress is to tune out.
You mentioned you described this in a previous interview, but describe it now. Describe your youth.
So I was a baby in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, born in January, 2 months before the Germans occupied Hungary. Jewish parents. My father was away in forced labor. My grandparents were killed in Auschwitz. My mother was a very stressed and depressed woman who could barely assure my own survival. And at a certain point, I was separated from her for a number of weeks, at 11 months of age. She obviously couldn't give me a sense of comfort and ease and attuned communication. Her life itself was in danger, and mine. And so her focus was simply on survival. Under circumstances like that, the child's brain just doesn't get the kind of emotional input that the circuits need for their healthy development. But it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that, you see. All you need is people who are very stressed in their lives, as under the current economic crisis, for example. In Windsor, Ontario, which is a twin city of Detroit, and therefore an automaking town in Canada, in 2009, the number of visits for child with mental health disorders went up 50%. Now, so what happens is the parents are stressed because of their economic status and the uncertainty, and the children are diagnosed with mental health disorders.
Talk about holding on to your kids, why parents need to matter more than peers.
Amy, in 1998, there was a book that was in the New York Times Best Book of the Year and nearly won the Pulitzer Prize. And it was called The Nurture Assumption, in which this researcher argued that parents don't make any difference anymore. Because she looked at to the extent that Newsweek actually had a cover article that year entitled, "Do Parents Matter?" Now, if you want to get the full stupidity of that question, you have to imagine a veterinarian magazine asking, does the mother cat make any difference? Or does mother bear matter? But the research showed that children are being more influenced now in their tastes, in their attitudes, and their behaviors by peers than by parents. This poor researcher concluded that this is somehow natural. And what she mistook was that what is the norm in North America, she actually thought that was natural and healthy. In fact, it isn't. So our book, Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers, is about showing why it is true that children are being more influenced by the kids these days than by their parents, but just what an aberration that is and what a distortion it is of normal human development. Because normal human development demands, as normal mammalian development demands, the presence of nurturing parents. But, you know, even birds. Birds don't develop properly unless the mother and father bird are there. Bears, cats, rats, mice, all the most social human beings, because human beings are the least mature and the most dependent for the longest period of time.
Can you talk about the importance of attachment?
Attachment is the drive to be close to somebody, and attachment is a powerful force in human relationship. In fact, the most powerful force there is. Even as adults, we're in attachment relationships. The people we want to be close to are lost to us, or they're threatened somehow. We get very disoriented, very upset. Now, for children and babies and adolescents, that's an absolute necessity, because the more immature you are, the more you need your attachments. It's like a force of gravity that pulls two bodies together. Now, when the attachment goes in the wrong direction, instead of to the adults, but to the peer group, childhood development is completely distorted, development is stopped in its tracks, and parenting and teaching become extremely difficult.